Hello, here welcome back. We're going to continue with Evolution.
Anime My Hero Academia / rated M, English, Adventure and
Oops, sorry, I was supposed to be reading something else. It's not fully there though. It's not fully done. There's gonna be a lot more though for it, so don't worry.
Chapter 24. I know it's been a while, so here's a quick recap on everyone's evolved quirks. Rumi is simply stronger. Himiko can use other people's quirks. Mei has X-ray and infrared vision, can zoom with both. Okako can make people heavier. Tsu can secrete paralytic mucus on her skin and is stronger. Hitachi only needs a response even if it's not verbal. Momo uses molecules in the air to supplement the creation of objects, making her upper limit of items much higher. She also has photographic memory. Kyoka has naturally occurring gauged ears that her jacks can plug into. Mina has an Android 21-esque tail and can make rubber cement like glue that doesn't stick to her. Toru can extend her invisibility to encompass her clothes and anything else she is touching. Aoyama doesn't get tummy aches and can shoot lasers from his hands as well, has little diamonds where the lasers shoot from. Aitsa had engines in his arms like his elder brother. Kaminari can shoot his electricity from his fingers, finger gun style. Kiri's Hima can use Unbreakable for far longer. Shoji can regenerate his arms quickly. Siro can create double-sided tape and his tape doesn't stick to him. Tokoyami can gift a semi-sentient mini Dark Shadow to someone else. Bakugo and Todoroki don't have evolutions yet. Izuku can evolve quirks with evolution. He see in infrared and make a smoke screen with smoke screen. Danger sense heightens his perception of time the more danger he's in. Float reduces wind resistance to almost zero, making him capable of supersonic flight. Black Whip is wildly more controllable and malleable, can use it like extra muscle fibers, think muscular. Empathy lets him sense others' emotions as well as influence them, not subtle. Cell activation is a minor healing quirk that also restores stamina and makes people stronger over time. It's always passively in use by Izuku. Izuku watched as teams formed around him, their members eyeing him and likely coming up with a game plan to fight him. Mei had almost literally jumped at the opportunity to team up with her fellow inventor Momo. Those two could be a problem if Mei could convince Momo to go along with her ideas. Hopefully he wasn't about to see any surface-to-air missiles firing at him. Himiko said she wanted to try teaming up with someone else since they did the battle trials together already. It was understandable that she wanted to experience being with other teammates. Todoroki, Siro, Hitachi, and Aitsa had formed a team. Bakugo was voluntold that he was teaming up with Kiri's Hima and Kaminari. Tokoyami, Mizo, the rock-faced boy he now knew was named Kota, and the diminutive boy with grape-like hair had formed a team. Monoma, Tsuburaba, Kaibara, and Kurohiro were on another team. Tetsu, Juzo, Awaze, and Shiozaki had joined up. Kendo, Yanagi, Tokage, and Komoru were on the same team. Kode, Bondo, Manga, and Shota had teamed up. Shizhida, Rin, Kamakiri, and Pony were also on a team. Izuku glanced over to Rumi, who was standing beside him with her arms crossed and looking like she was ready to take on the world. The other students eyeing them like lunch was only serving to lift her spirits further. Her reasoning to stick with him was simple. Everyone was going to be aiming for his team and she wanted to fight everyone. He knew he shouldn't be surprised at this point in their relationship, but still. Tsu and Okako came walking up to them then. "Room for two more?" Okako asked with her adorable accent. He still couldn't believe people had tried to make fun of her for it when she first moved to the city from the country. He was glad that instead of hiding it she had doubled down, which led to bullying and Okako getting into a surprising amount of schoolyard scraps. "For you too?" "Damn right there is." Rumi boomed. "You're not worried about everyone coming after our flag?" Izuku asked. "I don't run from a fight," Okako growled with determination that was honestly as frightening as it was attractive. "All we have to do is play defense and we win, ribbit," Tsu said before pressing her petite frame against his much larger one. Besides, why wouldn't I want to be with as many of my mates as possible? She gets it, Rumi chimed in. Izuku glanced at Rumi with a raised eyebrow, but she said. Rumi's resulting blush and embarrassed expression was enough to tell him that she hadn't told him the whole reason for wanting to be on his team. Instincts of animal quirk users were fascinating, he really wished he had a notebook. Ah, Okako squealed, Comperzion rolling off of her. Comperzion was a fun word Nejire had taught him that essentially meant the opposite of jealousy. It was nice to better describe the feeling of happiness he felt when he saw his girlfriends being in love. Once the teams had been assembled, everyone was ushered off the field for a few minutes while they made alterations. A short while later they were allowed back into the stadium only to discover a veritable forest where the open grass field had once been. Midnight handed out a flag with the cumulative point value of the team proudly displayed to each team. Ectoplasm clones guided each team to their respective base where their flag was to be planted. The trees were plenty thick enough to conceal where each team had gone. The flag was planted in a concrete base with empty holes for many more flags. The only real rule was that a team couldn't move a flag once they had planted it, making the strategy of playing keep away null and void. When the timer ran out, only the flags that were planted would count for a team's total. The other rule, the one that concerned him, was the rule stating that anyone that was KO'd would be out regardless if their team had won. The rule made sense in a practical way since anyone that was KO'd in the field would be helpless and as good as dead if a villain had anything to say about it. So what's the plan? Rumi asked him as the ectoplasm clone began to walk away. Defense is our best strategy since we already have the points to win and nobody knows where our base is. That being said, we have to plan for our flag getting stolen at some point. Tsu, Okako, are you two up to going after as many easy to get flags as possible? I'm willing to bet that some lower point teams will all but abandon their flags in favor of going fully on offense, Izuku asked. Sounds like a plan, Okako agreed, the other girls nodding in agreement. Himiko kicked off her ill-fitting, uncomfortable shoes and flexed her toes, the claws extending and digging into the soft earth. Her and her team that consisted of Mina, Toru, and Aoyama had just gotten to their flag and were awaiting the start of the round. Whoa, have you always had claws on your feet? Mina asked, pointing at the claws in question. Himiko hummed an affirmative as she closed her eyes and scented the air of the small forest. She had no clue how UA made a forest spring up in the middle of the stadium, but it even smelled real. I used to file them down so I could fit into shoes more comfortably, Himiko said after a moment of silence. But not anymore. Toru asked. Did you know that Yuki hates wearing shoes? She only wears them because she doesn't want to be the only one without them, Himiko said instead of explaining. What does that have to do with it? Aoyama asked, his eyes sparkling as if he knew the answer. Himiko blushed lightly in realization that she couldn't escape answering. I thought that if I stopped wearing shoes then Yuki would feel more comfortable not wearing them too. I don't want her to feel ashamed for being different. Magnific mirror! Aoyama exclaimed, his hands framing his face as if for a photo. Mina crashed into her and squeezed her in a hug, her pink tail wrapping around her, aiding her arms. You're so sweet, my teeth hurt. She declared very loudly, right in her face, her bubblegum-colored hair bouncing with how animated she was being. The floating uniform that was Toru joined in on the hug. She didn't stay invisible however, as Toru melted into the hug she became visible once more, her prismatic hair and eyes shining in the light as she beamed at her. Eri and Yuki are lucky to have you as a mom. I thought you didn't like to be visible outside of the dorms. Himiko asked. Toru shrugged, her prismatic eyes sparkling. I want you to see me. She explained, making Himiko's light blush grow with the declaration. We should think of a plan, no? Aoyama reasoned. Himiko broke from the hug reluctantly, already missing the warmth. On that note, I wanted to limit myself to only using the blood of my teammates. I know that in the future I will be in a situation where I don't have my pick of blood or even my reserves, and I don't want to become complacent. If that's okay, I don't need much. It felt silly to be nervous, but this was different. She knew they didn't despise her for her quirk the way her mom had, but tolerating her drinking blood and giving their own were two very different things. Mina didn't even miss a beat. She thrust her arm out and rolled up her sleeve. Let me know if it's spicy. I've always been curious, that intrusive thought almost won a few times. She said, laughing at her own half-joke. Toru rolled up her sleeve and bounced closer. Dibs on next. She rushed out. Aoyama rolled up his sleeve while making the smuggest look she had ever seen. First or last, it makes no difference, mine shall taste the best, he declared as if he was stating that water was wet. Himiko couldn't hold back her laugh. She shouldn't have even worried. Mei's breathing was shallow and fast as her, Momo, and Kyoka followed Mr. Pegleg. She was just so excited. Ideas were running through Mei's head almost faster than she could comprehend. Almost. With Momo at her side, the sky was the limit. No, atmosphere. Space. Galaxy. Whatever. They could make anything. She was brought back to earth by a tender touch of the back of a hand to her forehead. Are you all right? You don't seem to have a fever, but your breathing sounds too fast and you haven't been responsive, Momo asked gently. I'm just excited. Together we can make anything. Should we make missiles? Automated turrets? A mech? Mei asked, getting louder and louder with each question. Momo looked relieved at first but quickly returned to worry as Mei voiced her ideas. I would rather not violate any international treaties, Momo said. Those damn demilitarization treaties ruining her fun once again. I'll just be over here twiddling my thumbs if you two geniuses need anything I can actually help with, Kyoka said with some sarcasm that went right over Mei's head. Dear. Momo sighed. Great. We'll let you know. Mei began but stopped, her vision zooming in on Kyoka's calloused fingertips. Mei was on her faster than Kyoka could backpedal, holding up her hands for closer inspection. Do you make things too? Something small? Circuit boards? Nanomachines? While Kyoka was gaping like a fish at Mei's sudden proximity and questions, Momo answered. She makes music, Momo said fondly, her lips curling into a closed-mouth smile while her eyes became unfocused, as if remembering something pleasant. It's not like playing guitar will be helpful, right? No. OW. Kyoka yelped in surprise as Mei grabbed her by the shoulders, lifted her off the ground with the strength of her power armor and began to spin her around in circles. I've got the best idea and you're center stage. Mei yelled in excitement. The klaxons blared to signal the start of the round. Okako and Tsu creeped into the forest, already beginning their mission to sneakily grab as many low-point flags as possible. Several minutes passed without anything happening, even if he could hear fighting elsewhere, leading Izuku to wonder if they would win this round simply by nobody finding their base. With a time limit of only 15 minutes, it was looking like a real possibility. Ugh. This is boring. Rumi complained loudly, her foot tapping hard enough to compact the dirt beneath it. Turns out, Rumi only had to wait a few more seconds before a fur-clad beast barreled through the trees. The beast, who he now recognized as an enlarged and more bestial Shizhida, was not alone. Hopping off his back, Kamakiri announced his arrival by growing blades along his arms and beyond. He swung one bladed arm through a tree's trunk as if it wasn't even there. Instead of toppling, the tree stood upright until Shizhida grabbed it and swung it like an oversized baseball bat. Izuku and Rumi jumped over the wild swing and rushed forward to meet the attackers head-on, but gave pause when the ground in front of them exploded. Above, Pony sat side saddle on one of her own detached horns while she made fake horns with her index fingers. Countless horns shot downward and exploded in small concussive blasts. Rin was once again covered in green scales with his similarly scaled wings beating in the air. He had both arms pointed downward, an endless stream of scales shooting at them from his forearms even if they weren't very accurate. "I'll go high," Izuku shouted to Rumi. "I'll go low," Rumi replied. Izuku shot into the air. He knew how to deal with projectiles, his training with Gran Torino made sure of that. Hundreds of energy tendrils lashed out from his body in every direction, danger sense guiding the black whip tendrils in intercepting the barrage from Rin and Pony. "Shit!" Pony swore in English as Izuku quickly closed the gap. Izuku lunged for Pony, but the constant explosions from her horns were obscuring his vision, causing her to successfully evade him. Deciding that it was time to pull out all the stops, he tapped into empathy and began to channel despair into the entire team while taking a mental note to correct the emotion after the fight. Finally seeing a chance to use smoke screen, he released a cloud of it big enough to conceal the treetops without hindering Rumi on the ground. Okay. Pony was no longer having fun. This was hopeless. She couldn't see anything through the black smoke that suddenly enveloped everything. Not trying to cause friendly fire, she stopped her horn cannon and listened carefully for her airborne opponent. The fight on the ground made it difficult to make out, but she could barely hear the whistling of wind. Then, there was a faint glow of green followed by the sudden boom of a blow that cleared some of the smoke. Izuku floated at the center of the pocket of clean air, Rin's limp body held up by one hand, the other was coated in blood and cocked back in a fist ready to deliver another blow if needed. Izuku's glowing green eyes snapped to her as the smoke once again obscured her vision. Pony screamed in fear and resumed her horn cannon in the direction she had seen Izuku. She hit nothing but air. She was beginning to panic as she whirled in search of Izuku. Viridian lightning flared to life mere feet away, illuminating a humanoid form in the dark and countless writhing tendrils as well as two glowing eyes that were boring into her very soul. The Lovecraftian horror shot forward faster than she could control her horns. She closed her eyes in fear of the blow to come. A boom sounded. Nothing hurt. Hat. She cracked an eye open to see that she had caught Izuku's fist on reflex, and by the wide-eyed look he was giving her, he was just as surprised as she was. Animalistic instincts taking over once again, she lashed out with a hoof aimed for his chin. Black tendrils of energy wrapped around her leg, stopping it before it could reach him. More and more tendrils wrapped around her leg as she struggled against them. "I underestimated both of you," Izuku said before his other fist snapped forward in a blur of color that was the last thing she would remember. Izuku lowered Pony to the ground and leaned her up against the same tree he had placed Rin against, only to find medic bots carting Rin off on a stretcher and down a metal ramp that had not been there before. It made sense that they would be carted off the field once they were out, since if they were left on the field they would be in danger while defenseless. Izuku rose into the air again to better surprise the other attackers while idly thinking about those he had just defeated. Pony had surprised him. She was much stronger physically than he had anticipated for a backliner. Pulling his first punch was a mistake that could have cost him his life in the real world. Then there was Rin. He punched him without Black Cowl on the assumption that Full Cowl provided enough durability to withstand his scaled armor. He was not expecting the scales of his armor to change direction and point outwards, making it like punching razor blades. Izuku clenched his fist as cell activation finished healing the cuts left from the punch. "Motherfucker!" Rumi shouted from below him. Surprised she was having any difficulties, he looked down with infrared vision and saw she's Hida looming in front of Rumi while she was torn-cutting her arm just below the shoulder with her own hair. Below it was a deep cut with bone just barely exposed. Hot blood ran down her arm and dripped into the earth next to an unconscious and battered Kamakiri. Izuku cratered the ground and had glowing hands on her wound faster than his brain could consciously order the chain of commands. Her bleeding was slowing and her flesh was knitting itself back together, but much too slowly. He pushed cell activation well beyond its limits until all of Rumi was glowing green and her flesh was pulling itself together faster than he ever thought was possible with the limited healing of his quirk. The moment that she began to glow he felt himself begin to calm, the panic bleeding away unnaturally fast. Shishida is still out there, Rumi, where Riley? Looking up, he saw that Shishida was indeed nowhere to be seen. How did dash? I don't know. He fights like a wild animal. If that animal had a 200 IQ, that is. He's a problem, Rumi interrupted. Well, anyone that Rumi deemed a problem was certainly worthy of the title. He's hunting us, Rumi whispered, her ears twitching in every direction. Izuku summoned Black Cowl and switched to infrared to scan the forest. The second he caught sight of a large emission of heat, it was blocked by something cold. Danger sense blared, he dragged Rumi flat to the ground as an entire tree sailed over them like a missile. Izuku stood as Shishida was upon them. He was fast for his size. Faster than Izuku could react, a huge hand slapped his entire torso, the blunt force of the blow echoing past his carapace of faux muscle and throughout his entire body, sending him careening through a tree. Coughing up a small amount of blood, Izuku hastily got to his feet in time to see Rumi engage Shishida. Rumi ducked an open hand swipe and kicked the hulking opponent in the side of the knee, causing him to roar in pain as he dropped to a knee. His other hand, however, was not idle. Even as he was dropping, it reached down and scooped up a huge handful of soil that he whipped into Rumi's face, blinding her. You're so annoying to fight. Rumi bellowed as she kicked blindly into the cloud of dirt, clearing the air with the force and revealing that Shishida was no longer there. Behind Rumi, Shishida towered, about to strike. A black tendril of energy cracked through the air faster than the speed of sound and sliced into Shishida's thick hide, making him retreat backwards. Izuku kept his eyes on Shishida as Rumi tried to get the dirt out of her eyes. By sacrificing the area of Black Cowl that protected and strengthened his hands, he was able to create whips of energy that he held in each hand. His arms were at his sides, tendrils of black whip trailing behind him as he approached Shishida. Midnight Cowl. He roared the name of the super move that paid homage to his mama. Both whips snapped out several times faster than the speed of sound in rapid succession, each strike just barely nicking at Shishida's hide, causing him to wince and try to retreat. Each time Shishida tried to get out of range, Izuku would circle him and crack the whip where he was going. If he wanted to, he could probably dismember the boy with the powerful whips, but that, of course, wasn't the goal. The goal was to corral and distract. When Izuku intentionally left an opening, Shishida was quick to take the bait, desperate as he was. Rumi was there waiting. Lunati Harris. She roared as her legs wrapped tightly around Shishida's thick neck in a scissor lock. Shishida was quick to reach for her and tear her off, but was stopped when whips of energy lashed securely around his wrists and began to dig into the flesh. Rumi's legs bulged as she squeezed the breath from the boy, the seams on her uniform pants splitting once again. Seconds later, the 10-foot-tall behemoth crashed to the ground unconscious, Rumi backflipping off of him and landing gracefully. Thanks, Rumi said. Anytime, Izuku said. How did cell activation heal me that quick, and why were your eyes glowing? You weren't using empathy since you weren't even paying attention to Shishida, she reasoned. How did he do that? Wait. Eyes glowing without using empathy? Cell activation suddenly being stronger? Did he just evolve cell activation? He was cut off by the deafening boom and crunch of heavy footsteps. The tree canopy was parted by the biggest hand he had ever seen. Yui boomed from far above the trees. Several minutes ago. Mineta huffed and puffed as he tried to keep up with Shoji. Moments ago, someone wearing some kind of metal armor flew right past his sticky traps and snatched their flag right from under their noses. The cackling he could hear as the armored figure flew away would probably haunt his dreams. After what felt like an eternity later, he caught up to Shoji, who had mercifully stopped at the tree line of a small clearing. Shoji turned to him and motioned to be quiet. At the center of the clearing was a steel cage placed over the top of the flag capture area. The cage was surrounded on all sides by the biggest speakers he had ever seen. Standing on the roof of the cage were two people and one absolute babe. Maybe during the coming fight he could sneak in a feel? The armored one was finishing securing their flag into the slot and relocking the cage. The babe with the biggest milkers he had ever seen was checking over some wires. The flattest girl he had ever seen was holding a purple electric guitar. One of the girl's earlobes was connected to the guitar while the other was connected to some kind of switchboard. The one in the armor flew off again and Shoji signaled that it was time. Mineta and his teammate burst from the tree line to the sound of music. The girl with the purple hair had her eyes closed while she bit her bottom lip in concentration as her fingers flew over the guitar strings. The ground shook with each plucked string of the guitar as they raced forward. Tried to race forward. Sound waves blasted from the speakers with each note played, the rhythm only increasing in intensity. He tried to throw a pop-off ball but it just came flying back and over his shoulder. The skin on his face rippled from the force of the sound waves hitting him. Shoji's arms combined together on each side and stretched for the distracted guitarist. Just when it looked like he was going to succeed, the Ravenette leveled a grenade launcher and fired. The rubber buckshot blasted Shoji's hand away from its target. A pyrotechnic display of flames shot upwards, temporarily blocking the two opponents from sight. It was at this exact moment that the already quick pace of the guitar became a frantic pace no human should be capable of. The ground shook with the force of an earthquake, the nearby trees rocked away from the epicenter of sound. The sound waves that already made forward movement almost impossible now sent them flying backwards, tumbling ass over tea kettle. Then, he heard the purple-haired girl sing into the mic. On a cold winter morning, in the time before the light. Mei could not stop cackling as she flew through the sky to the fading sounds of Kyoka's guitar. I call dibs on the little rocker for internships. Present Mike yelled over the stadium speakers. That's not how it works, Izawa drawled. Respect the dibs. Present Mike countered. Mei's cackling redoubled, her plan was a success. She continued to fly around the arena while avoiding the giant girl. Other than her, she was unopposed in the sky. Either Izuku had already been defeated or more likely he was defending. Switching through infrared and X-ray vision, she zoomed in and out in search of poorly defended flags. She saw drill hands and Monoma being carted away by cute little robots. She couldn't help but chuckle at the sight of the mean blonde being unconscious. Her heart sank when she saw Tsu and Okako struggling to stand with mushrooms covering every inch of their bodies. Next to them was a mushroom with arms and legs aiming said arms into the air and spraying a mist of water. Mei had to remind herself that they weren't on her team and therefore shouldn't be helped. It might be the hardest thing she had ever done. They were her partners. Partners protected each other. Breaking that rule felt wrong. Going against her own rules, she flew on. Nearby, she spotted the flag that her partners were likely trying for. There was nobody near it, so she swooped down and grabbed the flag. When she did, the leaves of a nearby tree rustled. Out of the tree flew a head leading many pieces of a body. The head gave chase. It wasn't as fast as her, but she didn't want any competition in the air. "May fly," she said enthusiastically, while pressing the button on the canister on her lower back. The miniature drones flew straight for the head and its associated pieces. The sharp-toothed girl tried to dodge the drones, but was only partly successful. The drones exploded on impact, sealing large clumps of the swarm of pieces and successfully capturing the head. Mei drew her pistol and shot, the round striking the riot foam clump of body parts, the shock from the electrogal round proving too much for the sharp-toothed girl. Turning from the now earthbound and unconscious body, she flew towards her base to plant the flag. For some reason, Mei didn't feel like laughing. Tsu could barely stand, let alone fight. The mushrooms that covered her regrew no matter how many times she swiped them off. What was worse is that the mushrooms seemed to be parasitic. Every second the things remained on her, the more tired she felt. The little mushroom familiars would just reanimate every time she squashed one, rendering fighting them utterly useless. Believing the flag to be undefended just because they didn't see anyone was a mistake, they fell right into Komora's trap. "I don't think I can go on," Okako slurred next to her. "Are you giving up?" Tsu struggled out. Okako's face took on a look of defiance as she stubbornly raised herself from her kneeling position with shaking limbs. "Oh? You two are made of sterner stuff than the others," someone said from nearby. Tsu looked to see Komora waltzing out from her hiding spot, her eyes hiding behind brown bangs, her smile wide and confident. Okako needed no prompting, she lunged for the opponent on wobbly legs, falling face first at the mushroom girl's feet. While Okako was no longer moving, Komora began to gently float upwards, free from the chains of gravity. Okako had landed a hit. "What?" Komora asked, bewildered. Tsu couldn't find the second wind that Okako had, but she had other options. Her tongue lashed out and wrapped around Komora's ankle. With her last bit of energy, Tsu jerked her prey to the side and into a tree with a satisfying thunk. With her last moments of consciousness, she took solace knowing Komora was out cold. Bakugo pushed through the searing pain in his arms as he chased after Aitsu with the added speed of his explosions, leaving Kirishima and Kaminari in the dust. It took a mental effort not to refer to them as shitty hair and dunce face. The speedster bastard had his flag, and the one he had just planted, he wouldn't stand for it. He wasn't about to be shown up yet again. Aitsu was slowly but surely losing him through the trees, the added maneuverability from the thrusters in his arms proving enough to navigate the rough terrain with ease. Bakugo entered a small clearing with Suro and Hitachi waiting for him and Aitsu nowhere to be seen. "I'd call you a bombshell, but bullies aren't really my type," Hitachi lazily said while inspecting his fingernails. "You know nothing," Bakugo sneered as his entire body tensed, ready to attack. Hitachi snapped his fingers and winked at him. "Leave," Hitachi commanded. Bakugo's body was suddenly not his own. In an act of betrayal, his body did an about-face and began to march back towards his own, flagless, base. Was this really how he was going to lose? Without even being able to fight back. Himiko dropped Toru's form as she planted the unguarded flag she and Toru had found when she sensed someone nearby. Whirling, she saw two cuties breaking from the tree line. Kendo finished rolling up the sleeves of her uniform to reveal well-muscled arms, smiling confidently as she did so. Yanagi held her hands in front of her much like Tsu while stepping so lightly it was almost as if she glided over the ground. 2 versus 3. "Doesn't seem very fair," Mina lied. Aoyama agreed. Kendo's smile grew, as did her entire body, until the previously average height girl towered over them at 20 feet tall. She then shifted into a wide stance, one leg in front and one behind with the foot turned slightly out. Her arm snapped into position so fast that it caused the air to displace, one arm high with a closed fist in front of her forehead while the other was positioned over her front thigh. Himiko knew that stance. It was karate in origin and was called the immovable stance. It was an advanced stance that you didn't even begin to learn until you were a black belt. "How about now?" Kendo asked, a confident smile still affixed to her face. A tense silence filled the small clearing as the two teams faced off. The silence stretched on until the sound of a tree limb snapping broke. All hell broke loose. First to fire off an attack was Yanagi. Branches from nearby trees snapped and launched at the team, seemingly of their own accord. Mina acted fast, swiping at the air while acid sprayed from her palm. The wooden missiles hit the wall of acid and melted into it. Acid veil. Himiko quickly took on Aoyama's form and shouted, "Toru! Now!" Called the voice from the invisible Toru right in front of the gargantuan Kendo. Both Aoyamas unleashed 3 beams of energy each, one from each palm and another from their belly button. The beams converged at their intended target, Toru. "Say cheese!" Toru yelled as the 6 beams of light hit her back, refracted through her and shot out of her chest as a wide, single beam more powerful than the sum of its parts and struck Kendo full on. When the intense light faded enough for Himiko to see, she saw Kendo still standing with her forearms drawn together in front of her. The skin on her forearms was scorched and dribbling blood down to her elbows, but she had tanked the combined attack nonetheless. Kendo's front leg flashed forward almost faster than Himiko could see and struck the still invisible Toru in an expertly executed snap kick. The kick, which was intended for pure speed rather than power, sent Toru ragdolling all the way to the other side of the clearing. Toru's uniform became visible when she finally came to a rest, the control over her invisibility field failing as she lost consciousness. Toru! Mina shrieked in a gut-wrenching cry. Yanagi moved for the first time, lifting off the ground with arms still positioned sedately in front of her as she glided closer to Mina. Himiko couldn't be sure if she was seeing things or not, but she would later swear that she could see human handprints in the soil below Yanagi as she floated forward. Mina gave a war cry and launched a large globule of glue at Yanagi. The glob of rubber cement-like substance was stopped mid-air before reaching its target. At first, it looked as if caught by telekinesis, but that was not the case. It had struck something unseen. As the glue dripped down, the shape of a hand could be made out, rotating as if to better inspect the glue that coated it. Then, the hand simply ceased to exist and the glob of hand-shaped glue dropped to the ground. Acid Man! The garbled voice of Mina cried as her acid coated her entire body in a thick layer. Mina charged, a dozen invisible arms speared into the acid, arresting Mina's forward momentum. The arms, now more visible, were long, jointless, and arching directly from Yanagi. Mina was lifted into the air by the invisible arms as they wrestled through the acid. Mina was helpless as she watched the hands burrow to her and wrap tightly around her neck in sleeper hold. Spirit shackle, Yanagi murmured, barely above a whisper. While this was happening, the others were not idle. When Yanagi moved, so did Kendo. There was an explosion of dirt as she launched forward. At the same time, both Aoyamas fired their lasers once again. This time the lasers were more narrow, more focused, and more dangerous. Kendo shrank mid-air as the lasers traveled towards her, the lasers hitting nothing but air as they missed her now much smaller body. She rolled and stood just to the side of Aoyama and swiftly delivered a knife hand strike to the nerve center at the curve of his neck, dropping him like a sack of potatoes. Frustrated, Himiko dropped Aoyama's form and lunged for Kendo on all fours, claws extended. She aimed for the tendons at the backside of the knee, but Kendo's reflexes were enough for her to turn just enough that the swipe struck the meat of her thigh. Kendo winced as she bounced back, away from Himiko, narrowly avoiding a second swipe. Much faster than the first time, she grew to her full height of 20 feet and readied to counter-attack. Himiko threw a rock at Kendo's head, which she easily swatted away. At the same time, she held her breath and cleared her mind. With her presence successfully erased at the critical moment of distraction, she let her body do as it will. Kendo turned her huge head from side to side in search of the opponent that was previously right in front of her. Himiko struck. Her claws cleaved through the skin over Kendo's gigantic Achilles tendon but failed to cut all the way through the tendon itself. Kendo yelled a guttural cry of pain as she swiped Himiko away with a gargantuan hand that only grazed her but had her tumbling backwards nonetheless. Himiko came to a sliding stop on all fours, blood ran down face and into her eyes from a head wound. She raised her bloodied claws to her mouth and licked the blood clean with a wide smile on her face. Invisible hands wrapped around her limbs and lifted her into the air. Yanagi had set her sights on her. Himiko laughed sickly sweet despite her predicament. Her laugh changed as did her appearance. Kendo laughed and laughed as she began to swell in size until the hands that tethered her could no longer keep her bound. As she grew, she felt stronger and stronger to the point that it rivaled the strength she felt as Rumi. It was intoxicating. I know my body better than anyone, it'll take more than that to beat me, Kendo declared as she lunged forward with a limp. The two titans clashed in a resounding thunderclap of flesh. Himiko folded her fingers back to strike with the middle knuckle, the leopard punches aimed for Kendo's throat. Kendo was on the back foot as she redirected the blows away over and over again until she found the opening she had been looking for. With Himiko overcommitted to offense, Kendo switched from defense to offense in a flash just as she parried a blow. Double knife hand blows struck Kendo at the slope of her neck. Himiko collapsed to the ground, taking on her own form again, her eyes blinking shut as she saw Yanagi grabbing her flags. Oh, she's mine. Rumi claimed and prepared to run forward but stopped, her ears twitching in almost every direction. Incoming, lots. She yelled. Tokoyami as well as Kota came into view through the trees. Itza raced into view, Todoroki sliding into view on a patch of ice right behind him. Tsuburaba and Kurohiro showed up on the other side, Kurohiro slipping out of a shadow and Tsuburaba floating on what looked to be a moving platform of solid air. Tetsu and Awaze barreled into view, Awaze looking to be wearing a suit of armor composed of rock. 1 minute warning. Present Mike announced. The girls should have been back by now, Rumi said. We have to assume they were taken out. Nobody touches our flag. No holding back, he instructed. Rumi grinned in a way that many would describe as frightening, but not him. To him it was beautiful. Chaos erupted as everyone raced for either his flag, him, or Rumi. The first to move of course was Itza. Recipro overdrive. Flames erupted from the mufflers extending out of Itza's calves and elbows as he became a blur making a beeline straight for Izuku's flag. He was fast, faster than almost anyone could counter, but he was not faster than the speed of sound. Using Midnight Cowl, Izuku snapped a whip faster than Mach 1. The whip of energy coiled tight around Itza's ankle, causing him to trip and go flying back into the trees. Using empathy, despair exploded off Izuku in every direction, affecting everyone in the general area except for Rumi. The Titanic Yui snatched up the fallen tree that Shizhida had thrown, the tree growing in her hand until it was a titanic baseball bat. She made to swing, seemingly aiming to thin the competition for the flag. The sky darkened as the sound of countless beating wings could be heard overhead. Ragnarok. Tokoyami yelled as Dark Shadow roared and grew to monstrous dimensions, catching Yui's makeshift bat and struggling for control of the weapon. A glacier exploded into being, headed straight for Izuku and Rumi. Not even needing a signal, he and his girlfriend kicked in perfect unison, the ice exploding out and away. Kurohiro stepped out of a shadow right next to his Izuku's flag. At the same time, Rumi and Izuku were encased in a box of solid air that quickly began to shrink. Rumi was faster than him, literally charging headfirst through the container and drop-kicking Kurohiro far faster than the boy had anticipated. The boy was sent sprawling all the way into the trees. The instant the box of air shattered, Izuku snapped a whip at Tsuburaba only for it to be blocked by a shield of air that shattered but stopped the whip anyway. Not wanting to deal with a battle of attrition, Izuku retracted his whips and covered his hands in black cowl again. He leaned forward and with a mighty jump, he exploded forward and through several barriers of air to connect his fist with the air user's jaw. Tsuburaba was still crumpling to the ground as Izuku turned away in search of a new target. Rumi kicked Awaze in his stone armor, causing it to shatter upon impact and send him tumbling. As he began to stand, he touched a tree and Izuku watched as wood migrated from the tree to form a new set of armor. Upon a closer look, the armor wasn't just being worn, it moved as if it was part of his body without hindering him with its weight. Rumi didn't seem to share his fascination as she was on the poor boy before he could even fully stand. Luna fall. She roared as she delivered a powerful axe kick that collapsed him into the ground. A punch to the side of the head was Izuku's punishment for becoming momentarily distracted. Tetsu's punch felt much stronger than the one that Monoma had delivered with the same quirk, it felt more solid. Izuku performed a cross-counter against the next punch and hit the boy square in the jaw. Instead of striking hard steel like he had anticipated, his fist sank into Tetsu's face that was suddenly behaving much more like mercury than steel. Pretty cool, right? Tetsu asked proudly, his head warping the side as he threw a punch at Izuku. Very. Izuku agreed, grabbing the incoming fist with ease and whirling, using the punch's momentum to toss the boy bodily at Todoroki, who looked about to fire off another glacier. The two boys went sprawling in a heap of twisted limbs. Honestly, Izuku was surprised that Todoroki had taken what amounted to over 5 feet of solid metal head-on and still managed to grab the boy. The metal boy frosted over, becoming slower and slower until he was frozen solid. Rats came swarming in from every direction at the same time that the swarm of birds dived downwards, all heading straight for his flag. The sound of trees shattering sounded as Yui slammed Dark Shadow into the forest, her titanic foot pinning Tokoyami to the ground at the same time. The tide of small animals were almost at his flag and obviously being controlled somehow. He felt bad for what he had to do, but he wasn't left with many options. "Cover your ears," he called out Rumi, knowing she would do so. With all the power Black Cowl at 40% provided him, he clapped. The resulting shockwave of sound was far too much for the small animals as the horde of rats and birds fell to the ground either dead or stunned, he wasn't sure. Yui was on the move, but so was Rumi. As Yui lunged for his flag, Rumi was already mid-jump, the earth cratering beneath her. Rumi collided with Yui's stomach in another drop kick that had the Titan reeling. Rumi wasn't done, however, as she began to sprint up Yui's body, kicking off and beginning a backflip. "Blood Moon Rising!" she yelled as she spun into a kick that connected with Yui's jaw. The sickening sound of clacking teeth echoed through the stadium as Yui dropped to a knee, but still conscious. She articulated in frustration, shaking the blow off. "Izuku!" Rumi yelled in warning. Todoroki was almost on his flag. Izuku launched for Todoroki, flying just barely above the ground, a sonic boom sounding as he broke the sound barrier. As expected, a glacier appeared in his path. Izuku punched with every single muscle, foe or not, every percentage of Black Cowl that he could muster, every bit of momentum he had built. The forming glacier didn't so much explode as it simply ceased to be. Izuku reared back his other fist as he closed in on Todoroki, the boy's mismatched eyes going wide as the fist closed in. The klaxons blared again, signaling the end of the round. Izuku's fist halted mere inches from Todoroki's face, the resulting wind snuffing out the small flames that wafted off the boy's left side. Flames. Did he imagine them? Izuku had the presence of mind to send out a tidal wave of calm with empathy while he thoughtfully watched Todoroki stalk off. "That's the round, and what a round it was," Present Mike declared. "The ones moving on are Midoriya, Oguro, Yaoyorozu, Jiro, Hatsum, Kendo, Yanagi, Todoroki, Aizawa, Shiro, Honmuki, Shiozaki, Kode, Shota, Bondo, and Fukidashi," Aizawa announced with zero fanfare. "Pretty sure I burnt myself out trying to update 2 stories weekly, so my brain voluntold me to take a break. Turns out giving 42 characters their turn in the sun is pretty fucking hard. Forgive me Kaminari and Kiri's Hima stans. I understand that it's been a while and that fics can blur together, so if you have any questions about details, any at all, ask. Let me know what you thought of the chapter. P.S. I'm planning my fantasy quirk FIC, but there's something I cannot decide on, so I figured I'd ask. I'm making Cammy a succubus with wings like Morrigan from Darksiders." Chapter 25. The participants of the round made their way off the field as Izuku pondered what he thought he had just seen from Todoroki. Flames. It had to be his imagination. Nothing else made sense. He was dragged from his thoughts by the muted sniffles of someone nearby, as well as a spike in sorrow from whomever it was. Looking around, he spotted the Gen Ed boy with the rock formation forehead named Kota. He was kneeling amidst the battlefield and gathering up the corpses of birds and rats with the tender touch one might reserve for a family member. The birds and rats that were only stunned had left some time ago, but alas, not all had survived Izuku's attack. His stomach dropped at the scene. It was clear that the boy was heartbroken. Wordlessly, Izuku made his way to the boy and began to help gather the bodies with the same respect Kota was showing them. Kota turned to him with confusion being the predominant emotion. "I'm sorry about your friends," Izuku said, unsure how to convey his regret for doing what he had to. The boy seemed to struggle as he visibly mulled over his words before finally responding in a subdued voice, "Thank you, but it's my fault, I asked for their help." "Then you didn't force them," Izuku responded simply. Kota didn't respond, seeming to think his words over as they fell into a comfortable silence as they gathered the dead animals. It wasn't until they had finished that Kota spoke again. "I didn't make it into the hero course by 2 points, he said. Before Izuku could respond, he continued. "I'm glad I didn't. Nizu helped me realize a dream that will help animals instead of endangering them. With his help, I'm going to open a sanctuary for quirked animals. Their quirks inherently make them invasive species to their ecosystem, so they are usually put down. I'm going to save them, as many as I can," Kota declared clearly and with a conviction that left Izuku with no doubt that the soft-spoken man would realize his dreams. Izuku smiled. "Seems pretty heroic to me." After a standard check-in with Recovery Girl, Izuku made his way to the break room where the participants could gather, rest, and eat a light lunch while they waited for the next round. The sounds of chatter filled his ears as he entered. Everyone from Class 1B and 1A was chatting about the round, some with disappointment and others with triumph. The pitter-patter of small feet could be heard before small arms wrapped around his legs. "Papa," the owner of the small arms breathed out in relief. Looking down, Eri clinging to him with her face buried into his leg. Reaching down, he grabbed under the child's armpits and picked her up, placing her on his hip. "Hi, sweetheart," he greeted his daughter who just pressed further into him, suspiciously clingy. "There you are," Nejire said as she approached, a smile playing on her lips. When she reached him she pushed herself onto her tiptoes and pressed a kiss to his lips. "She was worried when you didn't come back with everyone," she explained as she tousled their daughter's white hair. "Look at me, Eri," he said softly, smiling when she unburied her head and did as asked. "I'm okay, everyone is okay," he reassured before making a waving gesture to the rest of the assembled people, Eri's eyes following the motion. Seated at a table, Himiko was busy spinning a story, complete with sound effects and dramatic gestures with her hands. Rumi was seated directly across with Yuki in her lap, her strong arms wrapped around her kid. Rumi's ears were locked in a forward position as she leaned in closer. Yuki hung on every word, the snow white on her tail as well as the fur that went up to her elbows and knees bristled with every dramatic wave of Himiko's hands. He hoped that Himiko was downplaying any gory details there might be, but judging by the stars in Rumi's eyes she was not. Bakugo was off in a corner eating slowly and with far too much attention to detail, his usual anger overshadowed by shame and self-loathing. Near him were Kaminari and Kirishima who were making a fairly obvious attempt to lighten the mood despite the disappointment clung to them. He might be on the best terms with Bakugo but he was glad that he wasn't alone right now. What really got his attention was Mei. Guilt was writhing under her skin like snakes. She was out of her Sororitas armor and in her fibro-muscle underlayer with not one but two of their partners on her lap. Okako and Tsu were both planting reassuring kiss after reassuring kiss onto Mei as the pinkette squeezed them as close to her body as physically possible. "Everything okay?" he asked, sensing Mei was upset about something. Okako nuzzled her face into the hollow of Mei's neck as her fingers mapped the shape of her opposite ear. With a pop, Tsu broke from a kiss Mei to answer. "She saw us get ambushed by Komori, Ribbit. She thought we'd be upset that she didn't help us, so we're proving her wrong." That made sense. Mei did not like breaking or failing the rules she had set up for herself. Her main rule was simple: help partners if they need help. Since she was always the best at math and science, she would try and tutor the rest of them during study sessions. Problem is, She had a hard time teaching things in a way that made sense to them. It had frustrated Mei to tears on several occasions. "And you? Are you all right?" he asked Su. "Just disappointed, Ribbit. I don't want to see another mushroom for a while," Su answered before turning her attention back to Mei. He was about to head over and listen in on Himiko's story but was waylaid by Todoroki approaching him. The low simmering rage that he had become accustomed to sensing from the boy had an aftertaste of shame this time. "Midoriya. Can we talk?" he asked, his voice not betraying his emotions, as cool as ever. Izuku contemplated turning the boy down. He really wanted to be around his polycule and check in on everyone in the class as well. As class president, he felt that it was duty to check on everyone, but Todoroki asking to talk was a significant thing. "Sure," he finally responded, giving Eri a kiss on her horn and handing her off to Nejire before trailing after Todoroki. Todoroki led him to an out-of-the-way hallway that led to the backside of the arena. It was the perfect spot for the clandestine conversation the boy seemed to want to have. Todoroki took up residence on the opposite side of the concrete hall but remained silent. If Izuku couldn't sense the boy's hesitation, he would have assumed Todoroki had meant to intimidate him. Izuku waited patiently for Todoroki to find his words. Finally, Todoroki spoke. "You overwhelmed me." Izuku nodded. He was pretty sure that Kode had overwhelmed him in the first round too, but he wasn't going to point that out. "You forced me to break my pledge." Izuku raised an eyebrow at that. Todoroki looked at his left hand like it had offended him in some way before explaining. "You forced me to use my fire." The flames, he hadn't imagined it. Memories of the USJ flashed through his mind, of Toru putting her life on the line to defend her classmates against a villain twice her size with nothing more than steel batons, of Tsu unmoving and curled up in a fetal position, half buried in the snow and defenseless, and of Todoroki shivering with blue lips and blackened fingers. Toru had nearly died trying to protect someone that could have saved all of them. Tsu never would have been forced into hibernation and left defenseless if Todoroki had kept her warm. Even Todoroki wouldn't have lost a pinky and several toes if he had used his fire. Red began to crowd his vision as he struggled to tamp down on his rising anger. Todoroki continued to talk, unaware of the rising tide of rage within Izuku. He was speaking about quirk marriages, Endeavor buying his wife for her quirk, his mother being driven into insanity and giving him his scar, and how he was going to beat Izuku with only his ice to prove a point to his father. Izuku could barely make out Todoroki's words over the grinding of his own teeth. He had endangered Tsu, Toru, and even himself. For what? Spite. Warm liquid begins to gather in his clenched fists. The adrenaline that was thrumming through his veins making him unable to feel his nails digging into his flesh. Through his haze of rage, he could gather that Todoroki had suffered much, but pain didn't excuse one's actions. He willed the muscles in his jaw to unclench enough to speak. "You've been through something terrible, but you endangered Tsu, Toru, and even yourself at the USJ by not using your fire. Holding back is a luxury heroes can't afford, Todoroki," Izuku said, far calmer than he felt. Todoroki's voice was as cold as his ice as he bit out, "I didn't ask for there help." The dam holding back his rising anger broke, his wrath ready to wash away everything in its wake. Arcing green energy roared to life, chasing away the shadows and licking at the smooth concrete walls. Midor. What the fuck is wrong with you? He boomed, his voice still echoing down the hallway as he stomped forward and glared down at Todoroki with baleful eyes. Todoroki was initially shocked by Izuku's outburst, but that shock quickly morphed into a furious indignation. Todoroki glared at him and made to leave, seemingly done with the conversation. Izuku, however, was not. He had meant to plant his hand against the wall to cut the boy off. Instead, his hand buried itself wrist deep into the concrete, his finely tuned control crumbling in the face of his terrible rage. "You gave me a declaration of war, I'll give you a warning. Face me in the arena at your own risk. Izuku extracted his hand from the concrete and let Todoroki walk away. He turned to the camera in the hallway. Sir. Yes, Cub. Nizu's voice asked from a nearby speaker. You knew about this? He asked, already suspecting the answer. Of course, Nizu chirped. How has he not been removed from the hero course for his inaction at the USJ? He barely managed to ask, his jaw clenching so hard that he could barely speak the words. If he had his provisional license he would have been, or worse. It was his first week as a hero course student, making him little more than a civilian. He had no more obligation to save anyone than a civilian would in a crisis. Unbidden, Black Whip snapped out and gouged a deep furrow into the concrete. Black Whip almost seemed to be writhing in anger as well. You can't possibly intend to let him become a hero that lets people die that could have been saved if he hadn't been holding back, Izuku challenged. Of course not. He has been warned that he needs to use his fire time and time again. He doesn't know it, but the festival is his last chance. If he does not properly use his fire he will be removed from the hero course. Nizu happily explained. By the time Izuku had stomped his way back to the private cafeteria there was only a minute or two left to eat. After grabbing a plate of food he sat heavily into a seat and began shoveling food into his mouth. Nejire sat next to him and placed a warm hand on his back, rubbing it in calming circles, no doubt sensing his mood. What did Todoroki want to talk about? She asked. Fire, he gritted out between mouthfuls of food without looking at her. Nejire inhaled softly, her gasp was a quiet thing, barely even noticeable, but he had heard it. Izuku froze, food halfway to his mouth. You knew. It wasn't a question. As dorm supervisor, I can't share students' personal information and it's something he wanted to keep secret. I'm not sorry for doing my job, she said, proud and defiant before asking a few silent seconds after, far less sure of herself, are you angry with me? He was certainly angry with Todoroki, but Nejire? Irritated maybe, she had kept something important from him but she had solid reasons for doing so. Seconds passed without him looking at her or answering. Hurt began to coil off of her, the sensation making him feel sick to his stomach. Izuku swallowed and turned to look at her. Moisture had begun to accumulate at the corners of her eyes and her jaw was clenched. She seemed resolved to weather his anger, to be the bigger person. It was heartbreaking that she felt the need at all. His anger vanished like smoke on the wind. No, he said finally in a whisper as he thumbed the forming tears away. I'm sorry for my tone, I shouldn't have spoken to you like that. Nejire only smiled in response and rested her head on his massive shoulder, Izuku leaning his head onto hers, their hands intertwining under the table. The two of them slipped into a comfortable silence until Nejire broke it with a question. Are you going to tell Tsu and Toru? She asked under her breath. I don't know, he said. Suddenly, he realized how hard it must have been for Nejire to keep a secret like this. On one hand, Todoroki had told him all this in confidence. On the other hand, keeping things from the people he cared about rankled. An idea struck, if he could force Todoroki's flames out during their match then this problem would solve itself. The first bracket consisted of, Todoroki vs Honnuki, himself vs Shota, Manga vs Hitachi, and Momo vs Rumi. The second bracket consisted of, Siro vs Shiozaki, Kyoka vs Itsuka, Yanagi vs Mei, and Kode vs Bondo. If Todoroki managed to half-ass his way past his first fight then Izuku and he would fight in the second round of fights. That is if Izuku could manage to focus on his first fight and not get caught daydreaming about punching Todoroki until flames came out like some kind of pyrotechnic piñata. Izuku couldn't stop glaring at the two-toned boy as he watched him take his place in the arena opposite of Honnuki. He worked his jaw as he clenched the armrests of his chair, the metal groaning under his hands. Yuki's sharp claws digging into his thigh snapped him out of his violent daydreaming. Looking down, he saw his little girl climbing her way onto his lap one-handed, her other arm wrapped possessively around a tub of popcorn that was nearly as big as she was. Momo had gotten Yuki and Eri more snacks than they could possibly eat. When Izuku tried to repay the Ravenette, she had only smiled serenely and ignored him pointedly. When he had tried to press the issue, Kyoka had told him to save his breath because it was never going to happen. "Ouch," he said with a small smile, causing the snow leopard girl to giggle mischievously as she plopped into his lap and turned to watch the upcoming match. Now that the 1-versus-1 matches were underway, Class 1A was seated together while they waited for their matches to come up. Nejire and their daughters had moved to the section to watch with them. Nejire's hand pried his own from the now ruined armrest and squeezed it in silent comfort. "Yuki, try to keep your fur clean or you'll have to have another bath," Nejire warned, Yuki's fur bristling at the threat before she noticeably began eating more carefully. From the opposite side, Toru leaned in to whisper in his ear, "I haven't seen that look in your eye since the polar bear villain at the USJ. What's wrong?" The genuine worry in her voice and aura made his heart clench, for he couldn't tell her, not yet. "Why I'm mad will either become apparent soon or I'll tell you why later today," he said. Toru placed a hand on his shoulder. "Okay, but I don't like seeing that look in someone so kind," she said, her voice laced with too many emotions to decipher. Izuku turned to look into Toru's prismatic eyes that held all the colors of an ever-shifting rainbow. He saw only truth and care there. "Thank you, for worrying about me," he said sincerely. The alabaster skin on Toru's cheeks reddened as her gaze flicked away for a moment. It was then that he realized how close they were. He thought that she might turn invisible in order to avoid her apparent embarrassment, but she didn't. Only a moment later her eyes slid back. Now, looking into her eyes again, he saw affection and maybe something more. "Fight!" Midnight shouted. The air took on a sudden chill as a veritable iceberg spawned into existence. Snapping his eyes to the match, he saw Todoroki's breath misting the air and the iceberg where Honoki had been standing. Just as a shivering Midnight was about to call the match, something happened. The massive amount of ice began to wobble like jello before it began to turn liquid and collapse on itself. It didn't seem to be melting in a normal sense at all. Honoki's head popped out of the blob of the liquid but not melted ice and cackled with his unhidden teeth on full display. Kek kek kek. The blob of ice began to shift quickly to form the shape of a massive hand that clenched into a fist and rocketed for Todoroki. Clearly agitated, Todoroki slammed his food down once more, but this time there was no iceberg. Instead, the fist of ice froze solid again, its collision course with him halted. What followed was a tug of war with Honoki softening the ice and Todoroki freezing it solid again. It became a battle of attrition, Todoroki's shiver becoming more and more prevalent while Honoki's chattering teeth could be heard from here. Minutes passed as the two were locked in a stalemate. The chill in the air became cold enough that he began to worry about Tsu. When Izuku turned to check on the frog girl, he saw Momo producing one of Mei's wireless heated blankets and layering it atop two others that were already on a very toasty-looking Tsu. Idly, he mused that Momo and Mei must be seriously getting along in their support class if Mei was sharing her schematics with her. He watched as Momo continued to fuss, Tsu seemingly content to let her. Izuku had always taken to the caretaker role because that was simply who he was and because being able to feel other people's emotions made it so rewarding to be giving. To see someone else taking on the role so fervently for someone he loved warmed his very being. Todoroki wins. Izuku looked to see Honoki's head was lolling to the side with his body trapped in the now solid ice. Todoroki was on his knees breathing shallow breaths that he could see from here. "Time for me to go," Izuku said. Yuki handed Nejire her popcorn, clambered down from his lap, ran off to where Tsu was and crawled underneath the blankets with her. A moment later, her head popped out from under the blankets to nuzzle under Tsu's chin. He could hear her purring from here. After a round of good lucks, he made his way to the arena. A minute or two later Izuku stood stock still as he waited for his mama to say the awaited word. Across from him stood Shota, but Izuku wasn't looking at him. No, his eyes were unfocused as he fumed over Todoroki. Away from Nejire's calming touch and Yuki's sheer adorableness, the rage had come roaring back. It was hot, too hot in his own skin. His blood felt like it was boiling beneath the skin. Midnight looked at him with maternal concern but said nothing due to the many watching eyes. "Ready? Fight!" Midnight shouted. There was a sudden boom that had some in the stadium wincing in pain and holding their hands over their ears. Everyone looked on in shock at Izuku now standing where Shota had been, and Shota bloodied and half buried into the stadium's concrete walls, unconscious, one arm dislocated. Not trusting his own restraint, Izuku had attempted to perform a shoulder throw to get Shota out of bounds. Instead, he had done this. "Midoriya wins," Midnight said in shock. In the next instant Izuku was gently pulling Shota's unconscious form from the wall and lowering him to the ground where medical droids were already deploying a stretcher. Remembering the scant lessons he had with Recovery Girl and thanking that Shota wasn't conscious, he popped the boy's shoulder back into its socket. When he began to channel cell activation, he felt his guilt and still boiling rage funnel into the quirk, leaving him calm as Shota began to emit a faint green glow. The moment he got the boy into a bed in the infirmary, a cane cracked against his shin, causing Izuku to wince in pain. He summoned Black Whip to armor his shins in time for the next blow, and when he didn't react, Recovery Girl's scowl deepened. "What the hell was that? You could have killed him," Recovery Girl shouted as she began to look over Shota and run some tests. A minute later Shota began to stir. What happened?" Shota asked as he blinked his eyes into focus. "I lost control, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have hurt you as bad as I did," Izuku apologized, bowing deeply. Shota blinked a few more times, confusion turning into realization and realization turning into frustration. "Don't patronize me, Midoriya. I lost badly, by the sounds of it," the man said with a stern voice that Izuku had not expected. A moment of silence passed before Shota let out a small laugh with little humor. "You really kicked my ass," he said before laughing again, but this time genuinely. With the tension broken, the laugh proved to be infectious as Izuku began to laugh as well. "I just wish I could have seen your quirk in action," Izuku said with a fading smile on his lips. "I could just tell you," Shota said. A tendril of Black Whip shot out to the other side of the room, Recovery Girl cursing loudly. The tendril returned with a pen and paper which Izuku grabbed. "Please," Izuku all but begged, hands poised to write. Shota's eyes were as wide as dinner plates for a second before he began to guffaw until he was wheezing. Nearly a full minute passed before Shota had calmed enough to speak. "My quirk was called Twin Impact. It made it so after touching or hitting something I could trigger a second, more powerful blow. As far as I could tell, it was roughly 3 times the original hit strength. After you evolved it, it can trigger a third time for about 3 times the second's power, or 9 times the original's power. 9 times. He idly wondered what that quirk would do if he had it and fired off a 100% punch. If All Might could change the weather with a punch, then he would probably blow a hole in the atmosphere big enough to pop it like a soap bubble. "You said it was called Twin Impact, what did you rename it?" Izuku asked, pausing in his scribbling. "Triple Trample," Shota said with a grin. Knowing he wouldn't be able to make it to his seat in time, he and Shota focused on the monitor in the room to watch the next fight. They didn't have to wait long to see Hitachi and Manga taking their positions. "Fight! Do you dash?" Hitachi began. Twang! Manga yelled. A decidedly cartoonish anvil appeared above Hitachi and began to plummet for his head. Hitachi barely managed to roll out of the way before the anvil struck the ground, splitting the concrete. Thwack! Manga yelled as Hitachi righted himself, a cartoonish baseball bat spawning into his hands. "You must like gag manga, Manga," Hitachi stated as the speech bubble head boy charged at him. "It's peak comedy." Manga replied as he readied to swing his bat. Hitachi snapped his fingers and winked. Walk out of bounds, he commanded, Manga following the orders without question. Izawa wins. Izuku got back to 1A seats and saw that Eri was seated in Okako's lap with her own tub of popcorn. She was busy trying to toss kernels into Kaminari's open mouth, the boy diving for each one. With each successful toss, Eri would look back over her shoulder at Okako to make sure she had seen it, smiling brightly. Izuku took his seat between Nejire and Mina. Next up was Rumi versus Momo. Izuku respected Momo, but in a straight-on fight against a foe that was far stronger, faster, and more durable like Rumi. With no cover? He doubted she would be fast enough to devise a way to put Rumi down before the berserker hair reached her. Fight. As predicted, Rumi exploded forward and low to the ground to reduce wind drag and to simultaneously present a smaller target. Momo was faster than he had given her credit for. The moment Rumi twitched forward, Momo fired a grenade round at the ground between them. Where the round struck, liquid fire spread and licked at the air. Rumi leaped through the curtain of fire, eyes wild and teeth bared in challenge. To Momo, she must have truly cast the visage of a demon clawing its way into the physical realm. What Rumi hadn't accounted for, however, was that Momo had been counting on this. Rumi was mid-air and unable to dodge. She had also lost sight of her quarry for a split second thanks to the flames. When Rumi caught sight of Momo again, the Ravenette was wearing dark sunglasses and thick headphones, the barrel of her automatic grenade launcher pointed directly at Rumi. Flashbang rounds began exploding directly against Rumi's torso in rapid succession. Rumi cried out in pain for the first time Izuku had ever witnessed. The sound was so alarming that he hadn't even realized that he was standing, nor did he notice that Himiko and Mei had stood as well. In all the time they had known each other, they had never once heard Rumi cry out in pain, swear in pain, sure, but not this. Rumi crumpled to the ground and rolled away, but Momo had wisely not stopped firing, the belt of ammunition feeding from her hip directly into her weapon in a never-ending stream. What was more, it seemed that Momo had taken to alternating the rounds from flashbang to concussive rounds like the ones she had used against Tsu in the battle trials. Explosive sound and light alternated with puffs of pink smoke as Momo pressed her advantage. It was painful to watch as Rumi was made deaf and blind as round after round struck her in a staccato of heavy gunfire. Even as round after round crashed against her and nearby, Rumi forced herself onto her hands and knees, her hands digging into the concrete to anchor herself. She lifted her head to glare unseeing straight at Momo with tightly closed eyes, blood now trickling from her ears to mix with her white hair. With a feral bellow that was far more animal than it was human, she blurred forward. Still mid-roar, Rumi released a wild kick at full power where she thought Momo was. It was lucky that the kick hadn't landed directly, because even the air pressure was enough to send Momo out of bounds and even Midnight bracing against the gale. Oguro wins. Unable to hear, Rumi kicked out again, and again, and again until, finally, she collapsed to her knees clutching her ears and panting. To his surprise, Momo was by her side in less than a second and went red in the face with exertion as she tried to help Rumi stand. With Rumi pushing 400 pounds of pure muscle, he could understand her having difficulty. Even from here he could tell Momo was fussing, and what's more, she seemed to be, apologizing even as she guided the victor off the field. By the time Rumi and Momo got back, Shiro and Chiozaki were already taking their positions. Izuku immediately noticed Momo's self-pitying mood, even if she was hiding it well behind a mask. Good job, Momo. You were at a real disadvantage against Rumi in such a straight-on fight and you still almost won, Izuku praised. Immediately he noticed her mood lift, even if it wasn't by much. Yeah, she really rang my bell, Rumi agreed as she still hung onto the Ravenette despite having been healed up. Seeing as her mood wasn't much improved, he tried again. If it makes you feel any better, I've never beaten her. Oddly enough, it does. Thank you, Momo said sincerely if a bit quietly before making her way over to Kyoka, who was waiting with a hug ready. Izuku and Nejiire grunted as Rumi flopped bonelessly across their laps. My eardrums got blown out, I got shot in the boob, and now I'm tired from healing, Rumi huffed, Nejiire and Mina wincing in sympathy from either side of him. Nejiire leaned over Rumi, her periwinkle hair cascading over her shoulder and curtaining both of their faces. If he wasn't right next to them, he wouldn't have been able to hear Nejiire whisper low and full of promise, "Want me to kiss it and make it better?" He could feel Rumi give a full-body shudder in response. There was a quiet sound of lips parting before Nejiire sat back up, her eyes dark as she looked down. Izuku shuffled Rumi's significant weight, began channeling cell activation, and opened his mouth to speak but was cut off sharply. "If you say I'm too heavy, I will bite," Rumi warned. He almost said it just to call her bluff, to dare her, because honestly, "That doesn't sound so bad," Mina says next to him with a thoughtful expression, her black sclera eyes tilted up and to the side, her full lips pursed in thought. In unison, Izuku, Nejiire, and Rumi all turned to stare at Mina, who had picked up Rumi's feet and placed them on her lap. "What?" she asked in incredulity, as if it were a perfectly normal thing to say. "Fight." There was a colossal tangle of tape and vine as both combatants attempted to land the first hit. Who was winning quickly became apparent. Siro couldn't control his tape after he fired it out, the strands only going where he had aimed them. Shiozaki on the other hand could control her vines as if they were an extension of her own body, and he supposed they were, actually. Vines exploded from the ground by Siro's feet, neither him or Izuku having noticed them burrowing at Shiozaki's feet. The vines wrapped around Siro's feet, tying them together before coiling upwards to quickly mummify the boy head to toe. Midnight gave a 10-second countdown before shouting, "Shiozaki wins." Kyoka stole a quick kiss from Momo before standing up. "That's my K," she said casually, even if he could feel her nerves. "You'll do great, don't worry," Izuku commented. Kyoka flashed him a genuine smile at that before nodding sharply as marching out to her match with renewed confidence. "Mama," Eri said excitedly as she ran over from where she had been with Okako and crawled on top of Rumi's stomach. "Hi kid, are you done feeding the wildlife?" Rumi asked, Kaminari squawking in protest and not helping his case at all. Eri giggled as Rumi wrapped her arms around her, squirming to get comfortable. "Ugh, I think I have a cavity now," Mina fake complained. Kyoka and Itsuka took the field. "Fight!" Midnight shouted. Itsuka grew to 20 feet tall faster than any gigantification quirk user he had ever seen. Kyoka's jacks clicked into her naturally occurring gauged earrings. Concrete exploded as Itsuka blurred forward faster than she ought to be able. She seemed far stronger than even her size would suggest. Shockwaves of sound blasted out in a sphere all around Kyoka, and just in time. Itsuka's fist collided with the shield of sound, the barrier halting it but not doing any damage like it had with Mizo. A look of surprise crossed Itsuka's face. A second fist blurred forward faster than the last. That's when Izuku realized she had been holding back. This time when the colossal fist connected, it blew through the barrier of sound like it was tissue paper. Kyoka was sent flying, bouncing across concrete and finally coming to a stop just before going out of bounds. Kyoka pushed herself to her feet, everyone in one shouting encouragement. Itsuka may have gotten past the shield, but it wasn't a direct hit, her fist's trajectory had been thrown off by the barrier. Itsuka's brows furrowed as she appeared ready to dash forward to finish off Kyoka. She didn't see Kyoka's jacks racing straight at her until too late. Itsuka tried to dodge, but the metal-tipped jack slammed into her shoulder and chest, piercing the skin even if only about an inch. Itsuka's entire body seemed to vibrate as she fought to keep standing. For a second, Itsuka tried to snatch Kyoka's jacks, but they proved to be evasive, one darting away while the other would stab a new area, the vibration slowing her movements too much to catch them. Blood could be seen trickling from her nose. Persevering through the attack, Itsuka took a heavy step forward that cracked concrete. Overcoming the pain, she fought to lean forward into a sprinter's stance. Pain marred Itsuka's face, but there was confidence there as well. Half of the platform exploded in a shower of concrete. Itsuka planted a foot down hard right in front of Kyoka, arresting her immense momentum. The stomp was so powerful that the ground exploded from under Kyoka. The angle of the force was enough to carry her well out of bounds. Kendo wins. Mei got up reluctantly from where she had been seated between Okako and Tsu. Want me and Tsu to help with getting ya in your armor? Okako asked, seeming to be reluctant to part with the woman as well. I don't need help. Mei said, somewhat disappointed. What she means is, do you want kisses all the way to the arena entrance? Tsu asked, throwing all nuance and discretion over the railing. Okako's face went crimson, but she didn't dispute the statement. Yes. Mei yelled before all but dragging her girlfriends away. Her cackling could be heard echoing in the hall long after they exited the viewing area. A few minutes later and Midnight was impatiently tapping her foot, glaring at the entrance opposite of where Yanagi had come from. Yanagi was in position and looking unbothered as she waited. Rumi had Eri on her shoulders and was angrily pacing along the front row of seats. Where is she? Rumi questioned nobody in particular. Kyoka came meekly into the room then and tried not to make eye contact with anyone as she made her way to where Momo was waiting with worry in her eyes. Kyoka, Himiko said suddenly, startling the punk girl. In Himiko's lap was a purring Yuki wrapped up into a heated blanket, her eyes drooping from the heat. Kendo wiped the floor with my team last round and we never hurt her as bad as you did, Himiko finished once Kyoka had looked her in the eyes. Not waiting for a response, Himiko went back to nuzzling the Purito she was cradling. Danger sense pinged, it was little more demanding than a phone vibrating, but it was there and he suspected he knew why. Quick as lightning, he pulled out his phone and hit record. Mamai, Yuki whines as Himiko rubbed her cheek against the child's head. Himiko's eyes snapped open, feline pupils dilated so much that no gold could be seen. She looked like she was doubting her own ears until her eyes softened into something so warm that he could almost feel it. She cradled the child even closer and pressed a kiss to the girl's head right between her rounded ears that fluttered in response. My little kid, Himiko purred with a waver in her voice. A hand gripped Izuku's forearm and he turned to see Nejire staring past him, her eyes misting and love radiating off of her like the sun that beat down overhead. Nejire whispers so quietly that it might be to herself, I was so afraid I wouldn't be able to give her a family. For a long moment he and anyone that had noticed the interaction basked in it, soaking it in as they watched Himiko forget the world around her. A second later Mei came flying, literally, out of the tunnel to land in her position. The faceplate on her helmet folded up to reveal her swollen lips and kiss-drunk expression. I'm ready. She shouted loud enough for Izuku to hear. Ha! Rumi guffawed from her belly, Eri laughing as well. Tsu came running into the room with a panting Okako close behind. Their hair was a mess, their clothes were disheveled, and their lips were swollen as well. Good, we made it just in time, Ribbit, Tsu said evenly, not out of breath in the least. Midnight dragged a hand down her face in exasperation for the girl that was essentially her daughter-in-law before snapping back to her role of referee. Fight. Mei drew her railgun pistol from where it was mag-locked to her thigh and fired from the hip so fast that he doubted most people could have seen the motion. For a moment nobody made a sound as the gunshot echoed. Then everyone realized Yanagi was still standing, not having moved from her position. A blue gel coated an invisible hand that hovered in front of Yanagi. The hand shot forward. Mei raised her gun fully and began firing rapidly even as a cloud of mayflies swarmed forward. The drones exploded into pink riot foam, the electrogel rounds striking yet more invisible hands. Izuku switched to infrared but even then the hands couldn't be seen, they gave off no heat. Wait. He refocused and saw that there was a displacement of warm air, it had to be the hands. Mei must be seeing the same thing with her own thermal vision. There were a dozen of them if he could see correctly, and they all connected with Yanagi's back. The now massive clump of riot foam was big enough to block line of sight. It fell to the ground, no longer being held up by the hands. Yanagi seemed surprised to not see Mei where she had been mere moments ago. Head turned this way and that, the most movement she had shown so far, then she looked up. With the midday sun at her back, Mei dive-bombed. She collided with the barely visible hands. She grabbed them and pushed them aside as her thrusters continued to burn. The hands were becoming more and more visible as they struggled to arrest Mei's movement. The servos in Mei's armor whined as she struggled to fight off the nearly visible appendages. Izuku switched his thermal vision off, and to his surprise, Yanagi's quirk was now visible to the naked eye, appearing like a shimmering mirage. Warp drive! Mei yelled through the speaker, or Vox as Mei called it, in her helmet. The wings-linked thrusters on Mei's back suddenly kicked into overdrive. Their plasma contrails grew larger and larger until they joined together to create what looked like massive wings of blazing plasma. She looked like an avenging angel descending on a battlefield. Yanagi stood no chance as Mei barreled through the now fully visible hands and punched her with an electric fist right in the face, flattening her to the ground with the force. Mei stood over Yanagi's limp form with one arm dangling, the armor too damaged to move properly. The other jerked and started as Mei fought to raise it above her head, fist clenched. Hatsum wins. Midnight announced. The crowd cheered and there was a scuffling sound from the speakers before Snipe's voice filled the stadium. That's ma protege for y'all. She knows when ta hold em and when ta fold em. More scuffling. That's mine. Present Mike yelled in the background. Woo. Rumi cheered. Did you see your mama? She asked way too loudly to her small passenger. Yeah. Mama flew in like a bird. Eri answered, her mama's excitement rubbing off on her. Momo stood up, worry marring her beautiful features. I'm going to see if Mei could use help repairing her armor. I'll come too, and don't worry, they have monitors showing the fights everywhere. We'll see your fight, Green. Kyoka said, getting up as well. It wasn't much later when Kode and Bondo were facing off across the arena. Fight. Kode began to grow larger but slowly, far slower than Kendo had and slower than MT Lady by quite a lot as well. Bondo was not so slow. What looked like glue began pouring out of the boy's oddly shaped head. He raised his arms and the glue began to float, controlled by unseen puppeteer strings. The glue flew at Kode and covered her head to toe, but she continued to grow. Bondo clenched one fist and the glue hardened instantly, Kode trapped within. Midnight began the countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6 dash. The Kode statue shattered. Bondo attempted to capture her again, but she was growing too big to cover completely. His window of opportunity had closed. Kode now towered at her full height of 60 feet. She bent down and flicked. Bondo tried to shield himself with a wall of glue, but it wasn't enough. The finger crashed through the substance and sent him sailing out of bounds limply. Kode wins. Midnight announced. There was a round of cheers before Present Mic's voice sounded. Next up, Todoroki vs Midoriya. Izuku turned in his seat to see Todoroki already glaring back at him. It was finally time. My muse is a fickle bitch with a very short attention span, well, that and I started a full-time job. Thank you everyone that left me messages asking if I was okay. I didn't want to break the 1v1s into multiple chapters, but it was becoming unwieldy in its length. Good news is that I'm already started. Chapter 26. Just as before, the blind rage had come slingshotting back the moment he was away from his family. Izuku was so busy trying to calm himself down on the way to the arena that he nearly didn't see Endeavor standing in the middle of the hallway that led outside. Midoriya, a word, the number 2 hero commanded. Izuku's eyes narrowed at the tone but stopped to listen anyway, saying nothing in response. My boy is headstrong, I want you to push him until he accepts his birthright and uses his fire. Are you up to the task, boy? Endeavor might as well have commanded, clearly used to his word being law. Or what? You'll try to buy me like you bought your wife? Izuku asked sharply. The flames that normally wafted about the man roared into an inferno, the temperature in the hall increasing 100-fold. The air was nearly sucked right out of Izuku's lungs, so hot was the blaze. What was that, boy? He told me everything, Izuku bit out with the little oxygen he had left in his lungs. Endeavor's flames guttered out in an instant, like a candle's flame being snuffed out betwixt thumb and forefinger. Gone was Endeavor the implacable hero. Todoroki Enji the man stood before him. Is that what he thinks? The man asked himself aloud, looking somewhere distant over Izuku's shoulder. His eyes returned to Izuku a moment later. I love my wife and children, he said firmly. The words sounded foreign on the man's tongue, yet Izuku could sense no lie. Izuku walked past the man and towards the arena. Over his shoulder, he asked, have you ever told them that? The sour taste of regret was answer enough. A moment later Izuku was standing before Todoroki in the arena. The proximity and the cold glare he was receiving was enough to make his blood boil all the hotter. He couldn't hear the actual words Midnight said over the sound of rushing blood in his ears, but he knew what she was asking. He nodded, answering the unheard question of if he was ready. The only way he even knew the fight had started was Todoroki slamming his right foot down, the move more predictable than Bakugo's right hook. He didn't even need to call on his quirks, they came unbidden. Muscles of black energy snapped into place underneath his clothes and green energy crackled. He brought his hands in front of himself, his energy-armored fingers digging into the oncoming glacier with ease. Muscles, organic and energy, bulged. With a great crack the iceberg split down the middle as it continued to race past him. The two halves of the glacier toppled away from him, colliding with a blue energy field composed of hexagons before it could hit the stands. Across the limited space of the arena, Todoroki looked on with shock written plainly on his face. Your ice won't be enough. He didn't notice Midnight swear under her breath before keying her mic and saying to Cementos, be ready, he knows. Todoroki sent another glacier forward. It suffered the same fate as the last. Then another. And another. Todoroki was panting, his breath misting the air, his fingers beginning to blacken at the tips. Izuku was heaving heavy breaths, not in exertion but self-restraint. He was barely holding himself back from lunging, but he had to. He had a goal, to expose Todoroki's flames to 1A objectively. He knew that Todoroki had suffered all his life if even half of what he had said was true, but right here? Right now? He was just angry to the point that he could barely think straight. Todoroki had the means to help people and chose not to. What was worse is that the people he had chosen to not help, to abandon to their fate, were people he cared deeply for. Trauma or not, Todoroki's reasons for not using his fire boiled down to spite for his father. He shook his head, clearing his rambling train of thought and focused on his current goal. How many people are you willing to sacrifice out of spite? Todoroki rushed at him, clearly unable to continue to fire off attacks with ice. Izuku planted a foot in the boy's stomach, air whooshing from his lungs as he tumbled and slid on his way out of bounds. Without conscious thought, Black Whip lashed out and snagged Todoroki's ankle, preventing the boy from losing via ring out. Todoroki took a wet and ragged breath as he tried to stand. Think, Shoto. You would have let Tsu, Toru, and even yourself die? What if it had been Fuyamai? Your nieces? Why the fuck do you even want to be a hero? Izuku's booming voice rolled across the arena like a thunderstorm over a plain. From his seated position, Todoroki's rage-filled eyes went wide, too many emotions flashing through them to even begin to decipher. He planted his left foot and began to shakily stand, his mismatched eyes locked onto his as he did so. Fire erupted from Todoroki's left side as he slowly stood, the flames massive and oppressive. The temperature in the stadium began to skyrocket. Winds whipped at the combatants' clothes and hair due to the sudden and drastic temperature change. Izuku's facsimile of a smile was one of relief that he could finally stop holding himself back. "Shut it down!" Midnight yelled over the whipping winds, but not over the rushing in Izuku's ears. Todoroki raised his left hand to point his palm at him, steam coiling away from his right side in a billowing cloud. An inferno exploded forward from his palm. The heat was enough to vaporize the remaining icebergs in a steam explosion that rocked the very earth beneath them. Windows in the box seats warped and car alarms in the parking lot began blaring, the shield of blue hexagons protecting the stands coming alive and warping under the pressure from the blast. Midnight's gas raced to encompass the arena, concrete barriers sprang up between the combatants. A sonic boom could be heard over the roar of the flames and the shattering of concrete. Through the inferno, an arm covered in faintly glowing black muscle fibers reached to grab Todoroki by the face and lifted him off the ground. A second arm reached out and grabbed his left wrist in a vice grip that threatened to break bone, pointing the captured hand skyward, a pillar of fire now racing into the sky. With smoldering hair and half-burned clothes, Izuku snarled, simply beyond words at this point. The raging cyclone of fire above their heads waned as Todoroki changed tactics. Todoroki grabbed the now short and burned sleeve of Izuku's uniform, frost blooming immediately in a cold snap that flash froze the entire shirt. The shirt shattered like a pane of glass and fell to the ground, the chest beneath that bulged with muscles of energy was unscathed. Izuku's face twisted with anger as he slammed Todoroki's head into the ground with a resounding crack. Izuku dropped to a knee amidst a cloud of pink fog and powdered concrete, his vision swimming with exhaustion, Midnight's quirk affecting him as much as cell activation would allow. In his half-conscious state he could have sworn he could feel something within him, that was at the same time not him, still raging at Todoroki, its anger yet unsatisfied. Midoriya wins, sit tight folks while we repair the arena, again, Present Mike said. Izuku was walking back to the stands lost in thought. He was conflicted. After the haze of rage had lifted he couldn't help but feel somewhat guilty at how he had handled the situation, he had allowed his rage to consume him. Todoroki's spite-fueled vow had endangered people he cared about and Izuku's protectiveness had eclipsed his empathy as a result. The slight screech of hinges above him preceded an added weight to his left shoulder. "Hello, Cub," Nizu greeted casually. Used to Nizu's eccentricities, Izuku returned the greeting. "Sir. Do you feel better now that you've taken out your anger on Todoroki?" his mentor asked in a squeaky voice. Izuku's shoulders slumped slightly at the subtle reprimand. "No, sir. I'm not sure how to feel. On one hand he almost let Toru and Tsu die, on the other I can understand his logic, twisted as it may be, for refusing to use his fire. It just made me so angry that I couldn't bring myself to really care about why he would do it." Nizu intoned wisely. "After being bullied into submissiveness for most of your life I can reason that anger is something unfamiliar to you. Consider speaking to Hound Dog about it?" A moment passed before he continued with a question, "Tell me. If one of your partners was hurt in a routine mugging, how would you feel?" Izuku blinked at the question before considering it, his hands curling into fists. "Angry," he answered predictably. Nizu hummed. "And if the mugger had a childhood that would make young Himiko's look bright? If they needed the money to feed their starving family?" Izuku blinked again. "It wouldn't change what they did to someone I love." Nizu clapped his paws together. "Exactly. Humans are inherently pack-oriented creatures and care more for the well-being of those in their pack than anyone else, reasoning be damned." A long moment passed in silence as Izuku mulled over what Nizu had said, well besides the cheerful humming coming from his shoulder that is. "I'm sorry for damaging that hallway, sir. And the armrests. Nizu laughed. Oh please, I have a budget set aside specifically for hero student outbursts. Izuku frowned, that didn't exactly make him feel better. Nizu's weight on his shoulder disappeared before he could hear the sound of small claws on metal above him, his mentor having jumped into a vent as they passed underneath. Izuku was alone when he got back 1As seats. He could hear many voices speaking at once. Both Rumi and Himiko's eyes snapped to the door as he entered with murder in their eyes. Rumi had her muscular arms crossed in front of her chest tight enough that her muscles bulged, her foot tapping the ground hard enough to crack it. Himiko had her claws out and was slowly dragging them across her armrests, rending the metal with such ease that the metal didn't even make a sound as it was shredded like tissue paper. "Where's Todoroki?" Rumi ground out low and dangerous. "We just wanna talk," Himiko said, sickly sweet. Her head was cutely lulled onto her own shoulder, but her eyes were cold and narrowed into slits. The dichotomy reminded him of a poisonous snake with its eye-catching colors and deadly venom. If it wasn't for Yuki and Eri sitting in their laps playing patty cake across the gap in the seats, blissfully unaware of the situation, he was pretty sure they would already be hunting Todoroki. "I handled it," Izuku said firmly, hoping to defuse the oncoming situation. "Man, this can be our vigilante origin story," Rumi said a little calmer and with a hint of mirth. Eri noticed then that he had returned and smiled at him brightly. "Papa. Mama, Rumi owes the swear jar. She got real mad when the fire went whoosh and started saying a bunch of bad words she tattled." Rumi gasped, "Snitch," and began tickling the child. Yuki perked up. "Mommy," Himi said HMRGL. Yuki tried to say, but Himiko's hand clapped over her mouth in time. Leave it to his daughters to completely defuse a tense situation. Toru and Tsu approached him then. "If anyone has a right to be upset, it's you two," Izuku said. "I don't really get upset on my own account, Okako usually does that for me," Tsu said, pointing with her thumb over to where Okako was seated, her bangs shadowing her face as she cracked her knuckles. "I'm disappointed in him, though I'm much happier to see that you don't have that look in your eyes anymore," Toru said warmly. "Well, I'm mad." Mina shouted and flailed her arms in a way that was more cute than threatening. "I don't get why he would hold back," Kiri's Hima chimed in, shaking his head in disapproval. Next to him, Bakugo was grinding his teeth. It seemed that even he was mad at Todoroki, though Izuku would bet that it had more to do with him holding back than endangering anyone. Truly a poor example of a UA student. Itsu chimed in. "Why hide his fire though?" Kaminari asked. "That's something you'll have to ask him about, it's personal, and even though I'm not happy with him I won't repeat something he told me in confidence," Izuku said. Okako laughed without humor. "Oh ho, I intend to." Nejire flitted over to him and pressed herself into his side. "What was that big blue shield?" she asked. With her curiosity, he wasn't surprised that she was the one to ask first. "The quirk of a new staff member that Nizu personally hired for the tournament. He asked me to evolve her quirk as a favor after she passed a series of questions to determine her credibility. He apparently found her working at a convenience store, if you can believe it," he answered. "Wow," Nejire said in wonder. Mei came marching in then, fully clad in her powered armor, Momo and Kyoka hot on her heels with worry on both their faces. "Please don't do anything rash," Momo pleaded. "At least not get kicked out of UA rash," Kyoka bargained. Mei gripped her Exodus pistol that was still mag-locked to her armored thigh, lightning crackled over her knuckles on both hands. "Come forth, heretic, and be purged," she demanded, her warbling voice menacing as it sounded from her vox. "Whoa!" Siro yelled in alarm. "You're going to lose your carry license," Izuku warned. It took a few minutes to get Mei to calm down, and by then the arena had been nearly repaired. Next up was Rumi versus Hitachi, and he could sense Rumi's uncharacteristic doubt as she stood to leave after Hitachi. "Do you have a plan to deal with Hitachi?" Izuku asked from his seat next to her. Yup. Kick M. Rumi said proudly. Izuku sighed. You can't just bludgeon your way past every problem. Rumi snorted in derision. I can bludgeon pretty hard. He face-palmed hard enough to ruffle his hair. Okay, fine, what do you suggest? She asked, her voice quiet and finally reflecting her doubt. Even now, asking for help was a struggle for her. When he fought Manga he didn't take control right away, only after Manga had responded to him. I think the wink and snap of his fingers is a diversion. Just don't speak to him and you should be fine, but then again May responded and didn't get hypnotized, maybe it didn't work because it was being relayed through the electronics in her helmet. He mused aloud. Rumi bent at the waist and kissed him on his cheek before whispering into his ear, thanks, snapping him out of his musings and sending a shiver running down his spine. Barely 2 minutes later, Rumi and Hitachi faced off. Fight. What's up, Doc? Hitachi asked immediately. Rumi smiled, showing all her teeth as she shook her head. Hitachi winked and snapped his fingers. Just as it looked as if she was about to lunge for him, her red eyes dulled, her features going slack. Walk out of bounds, Hitachi said calmly, and she did just that. Rumi snapped out of it after Hitachi was announced the winner and whirled, shock evident on her face. Her muscular shoulders slumped as she saw that the match was over with the screens all saying Aizawa wins. Her slow, almost dazed walk back into the tunnel had Izuku's heart clenching. He couldn't help but feel that he had let her down. He was waiting for her outside of the viewing area when Rumi finally shuffled her way there a full 2 minutes after Hitachi had returned. She hadn't noticed him yet, she was too busy looking at her feet and attempting to put on a smile that looked natural. She halted her shuffling pace when she got close enough to see his shoes. She looked up slowly and when her red eyes met his green he saw a rare vulnerability shining in them. She stepped forward quickly and pressed herself against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her arms folded between them. He wrapped his arms around Rumi and whispered, I'm sorry my advice was wrong. Rumi shook her head. Losing like that, without even getting a chance to fight back just brought up some memories. Right. Her birth parents. They had died buying her time to run from a villain, but she was too afraid to even move. Her fear of not being able to at least go down swinging had just been shoved in her face. It was no wonder she was feeling vulnerable. He tightened his embrace and kissed one of Rumi's long ears. The ear twitched and audibly slapped him in the face. Heh, Rumi couldn't help but chuckle. Don't make me laugh. Izuku let out a strangled laugh that was more of a wheeze. Rumi began releasing muted chuckles into his shoulder that may have been part sobs. Izuku couldn't help but chuckle quietly into her hair as well. It wasn't long before Itsuka and Shiozaki faced off. Fight. Itsuka was at her full height of 20 feet by the time thorny vines encapsulated her. Itsuka merely had to spread her stance wide and the vines ripped away, not even a mark on her skin. I concede defeat, I know when I am beaten, Shiozaki intoned calmly. Itsuka seemed to sigh, expecting this outcome. Kendo wins. Well. That was somewhat anticlimactic. My turn. May shouted as she stood,